Brilliant. Thank you so much. So yeah, thank you so much for the lovely introduction, John, and to everyone at the BSA who has helped me in the process of achieving this research, to Tanya, to Michael. And of course, thank you so much to the supervisors at UCL, Jeremy Tanner and Andrew Vivan, for having supported me so far in this undertaking. So indeed, this presentation forms part of an excerpt from my ongoing PhD, which is looking at a comparative analysis of three temples, namely the temple of Zeus in Olympia, the temple of Apollo Epicurus in Vasai, and the Parthenon in Athens. The criteria for the selection of these three temples is that actually they were contemporary. They were built or rebuilt at some period in the second half of the 5th century BC. They shared some characteristic or some personalities in their construction, such, for example, the architect of the Parthenon and the architect of the Temple of Apollo was Ictinos. And in the case of Olympia and in the case of the so-called Parthenon, the designer of the statues contained inside was Phidias. So the rationale of why I wanted to talk about this today is because I've always been fascinated about the way that humans have consciously manipulated space and atmosphere to transmit the sacred. And I think this image here of the temple of Kiyomitsu-dera in Kyoto, in Japan, exemplifies quite well what it means to create that aura of sacredness. And I can show you here a more panoramic view of the same temple, which gives you a better idea of what a sensual environment looks like. Here you can sense what the cultic paraphernalia that accompanies the temple is, and also you can get a sense of how dark or how well lit it operates, or maybe the nucleus of the temple. Nonetheless, I've always thought that if in 1,000 years from today, archaeologists were to reconstruct this temple, if it had fallen in disrepair, they would probably come with something like this, based only on the imprints of the building. What I realized is that, therefore, we are losing quite a lot of information in this reconstruction process, which usually we would not be sensing. And this is indeed what prompted me to look at classical Greek temples, which often would come accompanied by an image like this, a line drawing of what classical Greek architecture would look like. And this on screen is the traditional representation of the Parthenon and the interior of the Kela, where the statue of Athena stood, made out of ivory and gold by Phidias. Indeed, the way in which light was manipulated to create distinctive sacred space is considered a form of human creativity known as hierotopy. And hierotopy is a modern term coined around 2002 by a Byzantinist called Lidov, who applied it, as John mentioned earlier in his introduction, to Byzantine or early Christian churches. On the image, you can see the temple of the the Church of the Holy Wisdom in Istanbul, Hagia Sophia, and the way in which light was mediated, but not only light, but all types of sensorial effects, acoustics, what has been traditionally one of the many topics studied in hierotopy. Nonetheless, I am extremely indebted to the research carried on by Visra Pencheva at Stanford University, who had studied the sensual aspect of icons when artificial or natural light impacts on their metallic surface to bring out shape and form. Nonetheless, the study of light to frame and to stage the divine, it's not necessarily a phenomenon only observed in Western temples. It is actually something we can notice in Myanmar, in Asia, in India, in certain Hindu temples and other sects. In India, I've always found the religious practices of India extremely intertwined with those from the archaic and classical Greek periods, but I won't go that way today. Light has also been mentioned as one of the elements that addressed light in Mesopotamian architecture. And of course, in Egyptian architecture, which as some worshippers of the god Ra was quite present in their environment. And here in the image on the left, you can see the temple of Abu Simbel, where during the summer months, the rising sun would directly illuminate the back of the temple and illuminate the statue of the pharaoh and of the god Amun. Nonetheless, this is an exceptional temple, and if we look at traditional Egyptian architecture, as it's the Temple of Karnak, we realize a gradual transition from very well lit spaces, a courtyard, going slowly down up to the back of the temple, which was extremely dark, and where the statue of the god, usually made out of precious materials, such as gold or silver, was contained within a very small temple structure. But it's not only useful to look at the predecessors of Greek architecture, but also at the successors. Indeed, in the image you can see the Pantheon in Rome, which might have been one of the first special effects in history, where the entrance of the emperor during the month of April would coincide with the celebration of his birthday and the foundation of Rome. The links between the divine and light in ancient Hellenic world are well attested in the Homeric poems, where dazzling and blinding light is associated with gods and epiphanies. In fact, the concept of epiphany and theophanies, the appearances of gods, come from the same root as the verb phenim, which makes sense as appearing or bringing out to light. And the verb phenim has the same root as phos or phos, which is light. Yet this nexus has not been completely understood in architectural setting of classical Greece. And this is surprising if we consider the architectural design of temples offered many opportunities for light to impact on variegated material surfaces and produce gleaming effects. We have to realize that most of these temples during the classical period, the high classical period as it's nowadays called, were made out of stone, usually marble, sometimes of limestone that was stuccoed with shimmering, a stucco, a material made out of marble dust, which allegedly could be to obtain more radiance. The surfaces were also painted and they were gilded. The 5th century itself marks a transition and consolidation towards new aesthetics in architecture. There is a new interest in the understanding of optics, and hence the ability to manipulate this as part of temple design. During this time, the interior of some temples, like the Parthenon, which we are discussing today, was accommodated to house a new colossal statues made of ivory and gold. And these are the so-called chryselephantine statues. And this era tried to achieve realness via mimesis by creating the illusion of flesh, and the material effect could then be activated by light to allegedly evoke real epiphanies. On this graph, I also show that has been Christina Williamson demonstrated a transition from the archaic period up to the Hellenistic period, in which the ratio in between the area of the kela, of the temple interior, and the openings of the doors of these temples was compared, and showed that from the 7th century BC up to the 2nd century BC, there was a transition to temples were accommodated to be equipped with larger openings. So one could say that this was to allow more light to enter the interior, but and shy away from this effect that Marconi so much explained for archaic architecture, in which they were the temples inspired fear. Now temples appear to inspire more sensual experiences in the interior. Although we could also say that larger openings is because there was better technology available at the time. In case you are not familiar with the plan of the Parthenon, I put it here on the screen. The building was oriented towards the east, overlooking the Mount Imitus, and obviously looking at the rising sun. There was a statue contained within a colonnade, and in front of the statue there was a square pool of water. And this is a quite standard Doric temple, although different temples all over Greece have different idiosyncrasies that perhaps it's not worth going into today, but just for you to be aware. My plan today, and at the beginning of this talk, was to very briefly to describe and explain how modern academia related to the way that temples were illuminated. But I don't have too much time, so if you're interested in this, please feel free to email me. I'm more than happy to further discuss this with you and also to share a bibliography. But I still want to go quickly through these slides and explain that by the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, different academic scholars had proposed that the best possible way to illuminate a temple was through an opening in the roof, in the ceiling. And this is something that was also attributed to the Parthenon. Nonetheless, this idea has been abandoned in modern times, and there are obviously, there is a long tradition of discussing the hypaetral temples at the time, which it's fascinating, but I think it's just important to summarize that there has not been any finds that prove that these temples, at least the Parthenon, had any openings like this one. In the year 1883, James Ferguson, a British architect, suggested that the best possible way to illuminate a Greek temple was by the existence of a clerestory on the upper register of the building. He was inspired by Egyptian architecture, and the proposal here that you see on the left is how the elevation of the temple would look like. But this created several problems, which is, for example, what would happen to accumulate the water, rainwater. And these channels that he has here, just going under the peristyle, have never been found. So it's a theory that can no longer be supported. Nonetheless, Ferguson also claimed that if clerestories were not used, light from the main door must have been the method to illuminate the statue located at the end. And he had traveled himself to India and had experienced different cave temples like this one of Karla, but also the ones in Ajanta and Ellora. And you probably can see here the similarities with this colonnade on the sides and a main object that's the focus of the scene, in this case the stupa, in the case of Greek temples, the statue. Nonetheless, Ferguson had also noticed as well the existence of tiles with cuts, pierced tiles. These are called opeia, and proposed that larger openings than the ones seen on the screen might have given access to the clerestory if this existed. When we move towards the 20th century, this is the image of the Parthenon that we are most familiar with. It's rather standardized, and these are two real models. One is a small size model in the Royal Ontario Museum, and the one on the right, it's from Nashville in Tennessee. And I saw on the chat that today there is someone from Nashville, so hello from UK. This is the standard version of what we now understand the interior of the temple would have looked like, and it's in the year 1984, when Manolis Kores, who was heading the restoration of the Parthenon, documented the existence of two windows on each side of the main door in the east, in the east side of the building. Around 100 years earlier, Penrose, who had surveyed the Parthenon, had noticed the tiles, the roof tiles of the temple, and noticed that they were around 3-4 centimeters, and therefore marble may have acted as alabaster. It would allow light to travel through the material and be perceived from the other side. And this idea has been furthered in recent years by several scholars, and this is the new proposal, the latest proposal for the arrangement of these of the interior. I will discuss this, all of these, a little bit later in more detail. But I think just to sum up, the different strategies that ancient architects might have used to address light into the interior can be considered as follows: the orientation of the temple, obviously overlooking rising sun in the morning, windows, roofs with translucent marble tiles, pools of water, which I mentioned briefly earlier, openings in the roof, in the ceiling, and small pierced tiles. Nonetheless, however, the problem is that the fragmentary nature of temples, which are now mostly in ruins, do not allow us to test the efficiency of each of these techniques. So to address these issues, I had to recreate these conditions over an alternative workspace, which would allow me to reenact the behavior of light in the interior of these temples and to test the combination of strategies and devices previously mentioned. And 3D technology has been the best possible tool that I could find to do so. In fact, at the technical level, I implemented a physically based system for our light simulation, as it replicates lighting environments using the physical properties of light and the actual material value of surfaces to accurately model how light interacts with them. And these are very complex algorithms that, for example, considers all light bouncing in a scene. You can see it on the image on the left. The green wall reflects onto the side of the white cube. And I don't want to bore you too much with the methodology of the whole research, but just to let you, just to give you a little bit of the context, I had to set up four workflows to ensure that the reconstruction adhered to important principles. Firstly, that the models are replicable and that it avoids the so-called black box research, where no transparent methods are adopted by the researcher. Therefore, all the data that I have compiled here is well documented, and most importantly, it does not contradict or ignores available data. Because one thing I found throughout analyzing the ways in which temples were lit for 200 years is that in several occasions, archaeologists would omit important archaeological data just to fit in their own theories. And this also means that I had to come up with my own measurements. I had to gather data of each measurement, as there is no sole publication yet or monograph on the measurements of the Parthenon. I also came with a diagram that would document the certainty of each element modeled in 3 dimensions, represented here with a gradient color scale that determines the level of accuracy that each feature has. And of course, since the building is overlooking the horizon, the model has been positioned on a georeferenced local topocentric system with the outline of the perceptible horizon around the building. This is important because the height of the hill will determine the precise moment of sunrise and the shadows casted by the hills onto the building. And here you can see the Acropolis overlooking Mount Imitos. I then developed a system that calculates the sun arc from ephemeris software, which gathers all this data from NASA. And I therefore was able to replicate the position of the sun in the year 430 BCE. I've chosen this date because most of the temples were already finished, recently finished, or still under construction. And what this allows me is to assess the progression of solar activity and natural light inside the temple throughout a year, throughout a month, throughout a day, and an hour. Now, having said my framework, I was able to test the different theories that I mentioned earlier. And I suggest everybody who is listening to this presentation that if you're in a well-lit room, you turn off your lights or you pull your blinds down, because the images you're about to see are rather dark. So it's going to be better perceived on your screen this way. The first element or effect I wanted to test was that of solar alignments. And here in the image, I just share with you the way in which streaks of sunlight came into the interior of the temple. The best possible alignments occurred at the end of April or the beginning of May, and at the end of August and the beginning of September. This is the time in which sun would appear behind Mount Imitus and be aligned with the axis of the longitudinal axis of the temple would be aligned with the azimuth of the sun. And this is important because that's the best possible impact of sunlight over the statue as seen in this image. And the following image is how the temple actually would look at 5:45 a.m. in the morning on the day of 30th of August of the year 430 BC. It's rather dark, and you can see that the statues, the sun only illuminates up to the waist of the statue. It's a rather dark scene because light, the properties of light, they have to travel through the atmosphere a longer distance than if at noon, for example, where light just falls directly, light is just perpendicular on the surface of the earth. So there is not a lot of light intensity at this time when sun appears, but as the morning progresses, you start having more light at 6:30 in the morning. Sun continues moving, therefore creating different streaks of sun at 7 a.m., 7:30, 8, 8:30, and from then, the illumination in the interior rather stabilizes. I just compare here what the statue would look at 5 in the morning, at 5:45, and at 10:30, just so that you get a sense of how perceptible, how much visibility you would have in the interior. And also some illuminance analysis to show that it's rather dark space. Then the pools of liquid is one of my favorite subjects. As I briefly mentioned earlier, Pausanias, a 2nd century AD traveler, documented the existence of 2 pools of liquid in the Parthenon and in the Temple of Dios in Olympia. The one in the Parthenon was filled with water, and the one of Dios was filled with oil. And the Pausanias said that this was because water and oil, in some cases, would serve to preserve the ivory of the statue and the wooden core, or even the glue. And I think the principle is it's rather questioned by several authorities, which includes Morgan and Boardman, who first came with the idea that these pools had no function for preserving ivory, but they might have been tools for reflection and enhancing the experience in the interior. Again, the principle is simple. Light would impact onto the marble basin and better illuminate the statue. And this image on the screen, this experiment, was made with a sheet of aluminum or tin foil. But this has a problem, which is that water does not behave like a mirror, does not behave necessarily as does not preserve the properties of a mirror. Water can enhance. What you notice when water is on a surface and it mirrors the scene on the other side, on the other side, so to say, it's an optical effect. You have to consider that this is actually a 2 centimeters basin of 4 centimeters and probably had 2 centimeters of water. what is actually impacting the light that is impacted on the surface, it's being reflected not by the water, but by the marble underneath. So it's the existence of water or liquid would not enhance necessarily the experience. And it was Arndt Hennemeyer who already noticed in the study of the Temple of Olympia that the best possible reflection angle on these pools would not be enough to reflect light onto all the statue. And here in the case of the Parthenon, it's around 18 degrees, which would just illuminate the legs or up to the knees of Athena. And I have tinted the pool in purple so that you get a better sense of what light is actually being reflected onto the shape of the contour of Athena. In fact, if the architect wanted to really use water or any substance or even marble to enhance the experience, the reflectivity of sun over the statue, it's better that they push the pool towards the entrance. Also, an illuminance analysis that shows that there was not a huge variance in terms of light. This idea of reflecting pools of water can also be encountered with the existence of a parapet or a screen in front of these temples. Particularly in the Temple of Zeus, it has a very famous screen described by Pausanias as well. And archaeologists from the German excavations have discovered the imprints of this screen, which might have been up to 2 meters tall. So how does this relate, how the impact of the sun relates to this pool, if in the middle there was a parapet, is something that hardly ever is discussed. In the case of the Parthenon, in the 1950s, Stevens noticed the existence of dowels at the level of where the marble, the basin, the water basin, would have existed. And this dowel, which he claimed must have been to fit the curve of marble were to contain that water. And I have here prepared a small, simple animation. You can see that the curve goes onto the dowel and leaves an anastyrosis or treatment or work of the stone, of the marble pavement on the side, which probably could have been to apply a waterproof substance. Nonetheless, more recently, Milonopoulos has suggested that the marble curve would have gone onto the anastyrosis, would have rested directly onto the worked pavement, and it was a pole that would be fitted into the dowel. And this pole would have been offered support to a parapet or a screen. This is on the screen. I have reconstructed what traditionally could be understood as a normal Greek parapet of the classical period, but the reality is that this could have been a larger structure, or even more large, which could have obscured visibility of the statue. And this evokes early church architecture from Egypt, which was a direct descendant from Greco-Roman architecture. This is a very complex idea to explore, but just wanted to mention this because we just don't know. The use of windows seems rather, it's well documented. There are many temples with windows, and it appears that was a fashion, a trend at the time. The Erechtheion had windows on each side of the east entrance, and the Temple of the Athenians in Delos as well. Arguably, one could say that windows are naturally used to address direct sunlight into the interior of the temple or any structure. But the truth is that one could also think that they were used for ventilation, which we might remember. We have to remember that these were temples that were filled with incense. And also, these could have been used as windows of epiphanies to show to show to the public or to an audience some votive offering or perhaps some statue. Yet at this point, I would like to draw attention to the recent research by Vasilia Manidaki from the Restoration Services of the Acropolis, who has recently proposed and finally and convincingly argued that at the level of the Picranites of the upper register of the wall, and at the same level as the frieze, the exterior frieze that was located in the temple, there must have been a frieze, perhaps painted, perhaps carved in relief, which needed better illumination to be perceived. By the way, her work is, I know there is a publication coming up quite soon, so please stay tuned for it because it's a fascinating discovery. And here what I've just tried is to incorporate her ideas into this experiment and realize that indeed the existence of a window would condition quite a lot the light received into these aisles, into these lateral aisles, and onto the running frieze at the top of the building. So it seems that windows are suffice for visibility aspects. Here also the luminance analysis, so that you can realize that it changes quite dramatically the light admitted into the temple. Now we move into the translucent roof tiles, which I mentioned earlier, and this is a very complex discussion. Has a very long tradition, firstly documented in the 1888 by Penrose, in 85 Gruben and Corres further discussed it, in 1990s Haley, in 1993 Onesort, and in 2001 Höpfner proposed the idea that the certain number of temples, namely the Oikos by the Naxians in Delos, the Temple of Sangri in Naxos, the Temple of Iria in the same island, the Temple of Artemis in Paros, the Temple of Vasai, and the Parthenon all benefited from this strategy. More recently, Patek Horvath included the Temple of Olympia as also probably benefiting from this technique. In the image, you see one temple which we securely can say had a roof that could be seen from the interior and that most likely was translucent. I think this is a very intrepid hypothesis. It has been documented, as I said, for the Parthenon, for the Temple of Vasai, and for the Temple of Olympia, my 3 case studies. And while I was trying to test the feasibility of this effect of my model, this is the resulting image. By the way, this is not a final result because the calculations that occur inside the volume of the marble are quite complex, but nonetheless, this is the best possible transmittance level that could be obtained. Just by having a look at this scene, I think it provides an even distribution of light in the interior, and I think that serves the purpose of better illuminating the temple. But in my personal opinion, it brings in too many architectural aberrations, such as the existence of a longitudinal beam resting on top of another beam, which is on top of the colonnade. Also, the way in which the even distribution of light is perceived under the transversal beams, creating those shadows, it's slightly anesthetic. And I know I should not be posing my own personal projections or aesthetic opinions over aesthetics from a viewer in the 5th century BC, but also I think it diminishes the use or the existence of that window in the entrance of the temple. I also want to point towards the recent studies by Kozo Ike from the University of Tokyo, who has analyzed the translucency and the transmittance levels of different types of marble used in the roof of Greek temples. And he demonstrated that Parian marble, which traditionally has been identified as the most translucent type of marble, is the most opaque one. Pentelic marble is a bit better, and Naxian offers better results. And I need to mention something about the material of the roofs in Athens. So I had the opportunity to survey the roof tiles in Athens, and I have to thank Vassilia Manidaki for having spent so much time with me, sharing her thoughts. And here what I noticed, and I was fascinated by the quality of the carving on the top side, which you see on the right of the tile, has been well worked. But when I had a look on the underside of the tile, I discovered that it's unworked, it's quite rubus. And this goes against the opinion, against the view that Romans, who used this same technique, not necessarily translucent rooftops, but several buildings, you could see the roofs, the exposed beams and trusses. They would polish the tile, they would work it, they would paint it, and they would wax it, which is not the case of these tiles. Also, the material of the tiles have often been argued as pentelic marble, and sometimes it's Parian marble. So I think there is some study that needs to go into the substance of these tiles. Also, Corres discovered that the north side window had a concealed staircase that would lead somewhere up, that perhaps was an attic. It's true that this attic could have been located on the pronaos, on the porch on the other side of the main entrance to the temple. But the most logical thing is to think that there was an attic on top of the statue that would have given access to anyone looking that was interested in repairing the roof, and also in looking at the maintenance, just general condition of the beams, which were made of wood. One also must think that the use of this type of attics in medieval architecture, for example in cathedrals, was for checking the roofs and to lowering and raising chandeliers. And we might remember that temples might have had lamps, and some of them have been documented. More on that in a minute. Also, that traditionally Greek architecture featured the use of the offers would nail onto the beams of roofs or ceilings votive offerings, usually helmets, corselets, or weapons. This is not documented in the case of Parthenon, but it's not hard to imagine that these coffers could be removable and could give a better access to the beams if needed. Open roofs, which have been there, this is a problem for me, because there have been, for the three temples that I'm analyzing, the 19th century archaeologists documented tiles with cuts, as you can see in the image on the left. On the top is one from Vasai, the one on the right from the Parthenon, the one in the middle Vasai, and the one on the bottom from Olympia. And the existence of these openings is well documented for many buildings, but these are not documented in modern times by any of the surveyors of the temples I'm looking into. So also something the restoration services mentioned is that there are hundreds of tiles that not necessarily came from the Parthenon. So to realize whether this was the case for the Parthenon is hard to imagine. I was a little bit naughty, and I wanted to test what the Parthenon would look like if you had an opening in the roof. And one, I have to say, is extremely appealing. But again, many architectural aberrations are visible. In fact, it's hard to imagine that they would leave half the structure open with visible trusses. Nonetheless, this idea of having an open cella fits better the design of the temple of Apollo Epicurus in Vasai, which I'm also surveying and assessing. And here I have reconstructed the temple with an open roof, because it makes much more, to compare it just with the Parthenon, because it makes much more sense to have this column holding the weight of this tympanum, this triangle that you see over the frieze, something which we don't have in the Parthenon, which would then eliminate the possibility that there was any element that would obscure the visibility of those wooden rafters from if you're standing in the interior. The Temple of Apollo Epicurus, just to bring it into the conversation, is is fascinating structure built possibly by the same architect as the Parthenon. The temple was oriented north to south and had two openings, one on the north side and one on the east, facing the sun, the rising sun in the morning. And the temple had as you enter the interior, might have had a running frieze, an ionic running frieze that art historians have often claimed must have been there to be perceived. So if it was there, how was it better perceived? There is lots of academic work, bibliography associated to the way this temple could have been illuminated. And I have tested here again how much light was coming in through the main door, excuse me, from the east door. And it was Cooper in the year, I think 68, who documented that the solstice would coincide with a special phenomenon in which special ray of light would come into a specific side of the building, created some sort of effect. The reality is that it's very hard to assess what was going on here. I have reconstructed this temple and applied the same effects onto it and realized that it's a very dark building because the way it's oriented. So it's a very small building as well. It's not as large as the Parthenon. So the main door on the north side does not allow any light almost to come into the temple. Here in the image, you can see one of the times in which this temple would be best illuminated, if of course we were to reconstruct it without a skylight, just with a normal covered ceiling. What was going on in terms of cult in this building is hard to assess. We don't know if there was a statue or whether the Corinthian column might have been considered an iconic representation of Apollo. But the pavement of this temple is quite marvelous, to say the least. There is a very large slab at the back of this area, which is square and which seems to have been there to perhaps bear the weight of a large statue, like a bronze statue on a pedestal, which I have hypothetically reconstructed here. But there is also a very strange corner, the southwest corner, which has a stone, a protruding stone, which is embedded within the wall, which makes it very good to offer leverage towards anything that was weighty. But this is a very small stone. It's around 40 centimeters. So what can be there placed that it's small, but at the same time so heavy? Some archaeologists have suggested that this might have been to place a pedestal with a larger statue made out of bronze, and at some point in the year to be illuminated. But these are just hypotheses, and I hope perhaps I can offer some further ideas as this research progresses. I've also reconstructed the opeya, opening of the roof tiles, but I don't think it necessarily brings in more light. Pausanias also said the whole temple was built in stone. So this reconstruction would demonstrate the existence of wooden rafters. How does that fit into Pausanias' description? I don't have the answers. And just again, trying to bring as much light as possible into the scene, I placed several openings here just to test it. And yes, they serve the purpose, but I would say it's a rather strange solution. Translucent rooftops offered the same problem. I mean, it would bring in some light for sure, but I had the opportunity to touch these roofs, roof tiles, and again, the the upper side, which is exposed to elements, is extremely well polished, and the underside is left rough. And many would say, well, Juan, then why would architects use this special marble for the roofs, particularly in the case of Vasai, which the whole temple was built on limestone, but exceptionally some other elements on the roofs were made out of marble. The reality is that if, as Kostas Papadopoulos, the civil engineer who worked at Assassin Vasai, kindly suggested to me, is that architects at the time would only have two solutions for the roofs. Either they built it out of terracotta, or they made it of marble, because limestone would have been eroded within decades. So marble was the only solution to avoid a collapse of the roof. So I just want to share some conclusions with you, and these are obviously not final because the research is still going on. But I think to sum up, we can say that the temple of these temples I'm assessing, and in particular the Parthenon, was a large area that received limited light. Such observation is in direct clash with other architectural reconstructions of the temple interior that you see, for example, in the right, created by Paul de Vebec in 2004, which often, these images often show the temple as a very bright and well-lit space during even the morning hours. Natural light appears to have been a concern of architects, but was not maximized in terms of special effects as we might have assumed at first. No solar alignment, or what we call in certain late Ptolemaic Egyptian literature, the kiss of the sun, occurred over the statue, as it was only illuminated up to the waist. And if any alignment occurred, this might have been during the months of May, April, and August, September. One could think that perhaps that's the time that some special cult or ritual occurred in the interior of the temple, such as the Panathenaya. But this occurred in the Canton Bayon month, which roughly would coincide with our the months July, August. And these Attic calendars was lunisolar, so it kept shifting from year to year. One also might say that it's the birthday of Athena, perhaps one of those dates where the Parthenon is aligned with the morning sun. But ancient Greeks appear not to have celebrated birthdays like us, but they did it monthly, they did not do it yearly. Pools of water continue to be a mystery, and I'm actually working on a paper to offer some alternative solutions for them. The reality is that I am quite intrigued by what Fabio Barri from Stanford University suggested might have been occurring in the Temple of Dios in Olympia, which is the resemblance, the creation of a microcosm that created some statue emerging from the dark abyss, because the basin of this pool of oil was made of dark Eleusinian marble, not of the other limestone that this temple was, what actually is a type of shell stone, conchiferous stone that was used. So why the architect decided to incorporate, why Phidias decided to incorporate this material is still a bit of a mystery. And I think what was going on with these pools is probably something more related to ritual anointment and cleaning of statues than anything else. And this is documented in fact, the family of Phidias was entrusted with the responsibility of anointing the statue. And this is a type of responsibility that appears to have been extremely reputed at the time. Also, one might consider that these pools had something to do with catoptrics and the study of optics, and perhaps even divination. And I refer to the work of my colleague Tatiana Burr from Cambridge University, who has been experimenting, studying the use of mirrors in Greek temples to create auras of sacredness. Finally, the translucent roofs. I because the type of tiles with the underside not being carved, which seems odd to me, that all this beautifully polished, well-constructed building was left with those elements being rough, and would this idea would automatically clash with or diminish the use of the window seemed to not, for me, have too much basis. And the recent study shows that the transmittance levels for 4 centimeters could have been rather low. So I still want to bring into the conversation that if these were dark spaces, there might have been light related, artificial light related to them, and one needs to evoke the idea of torches, the Olympic torch or the torch bearers of the Eleusinian mysteries, and even more importantly, the existence of night vigils with use of fire inside the church or Greek Orthodox churches, and the existence of fire, the use of fire in ritual and statues is not well documented in Greece, but eternal flames appear in certain written documents that tells us that this practice of eternal flames, which seems to be rather Indo-European ubiquitous practice, might have been famous at the time. In fact, the temple in the Acropolis, there was an eternal flame in the Erechtheion, possibly in the Erechtheion, as the lamp of Callimachus, a golden lamp that resembled a palm tree. What's surprising is that there are not lots of lamps found in Greek temples or temple settings. There are some, usually they are archaic and they're made of stone. And this could have been because the ones made of precious materials were melted or stolen. In fact, there is one from the one on the top right that might have come from the temple of Artemis in Ephesus. In fact, most lamps that we find come from funerary contexts, but these ones on screen come from different temples from the Greek world. In the Acropolis, there was a lamp found in situ in the Erechtheion, and it was dedicated to Athena. And I just put here on the right the image of a modern Orthodox church in Corfu, which I saw that still retains this practice of offering votive silver lamps hanging over other chandeliers. I also found one in Kavala made out of bronze, and there is also one from a funerary context that it's slightly late. It's Etruscan, found in Tuscany, but the archaeologists agree that this might have come from a temple. So suddenly we start realizing that temples could have had artificial light, and probably quite a lot of it. And this is part of the research I'm going to be taking in the next few months. I'm going to be trying to experiment with artificial light inside these settings. The reality is that it's going to be a highly hypothetical work. We don't know how many lamps, where they were located, but I will offer some solutions or some ideas that perhaps someone else can further discuss. So to conclude, the reconstruction of the Parthenon has proven that a solid and rigorous methodology combined with high integrity computer-based heritage visualizations and with physically based algorithms serve the purpose of addressing research questions on phenomenological nature. It has provided more solid foundations for assumptions that past researchers had only been vaguely able to develop in relation to Greek temples and how these were perceived and experienced. Overall, Greek temples were dark spaces. Nonetheless, architects mediated light so that the eye had to get accustomed to perceiving the shapes of the cult statue. Brilliant materials reflected the ambient and sunlight of the interior and created a sensuous form that appeared to emerge from the darkness. Such vision might have been the thou mightest die the wonder to behold that ancient writers documented when looking at these statues. Ultimately, analysis like this restate the importance of experimentation as needed tool to validate and inquire over aspects related to ritual and cult, as well as architecture, aesthetics, and engineering. We have raised new questions regarding function and offer more concise answers to many existing theories and propose aspects of Hellenic art and religiosity. So thank you so much for having listened to this presentation today. And I would love to hear your thoughts, your opinion, your feedback, any questions that you might have, because it will eventually help me to come up with really good research that offers comparative analysis through different contemporary temples. So thank you so much.